Thank you very much. Well, I hope you didn't come here to be cheered up, because I'm not going to add to the sum of optimism. I love Mario Monti's wonderful, classically British understatement when he said his message was not entirely optimistic. There is a prayer which is said to have been created by the medieval cleric, Archbishop Grigua, in which he said, "Lord, things are serious. This time, please come yourself. This is no time for a boy." I'm bound to say that I'm afraid I have to confirm Grigua's hope. I mean, just take a look at the shores of this remarkable inland sea, the Mediterranean, and you see that around it were created, fostered, and helped to grow all the philosophies, all the institutions, all the cultures which gave force and effect to the European ideal. You might argue the basis of what we have known these last 2,000 years of civilization. And then reflect on this fact, that around these shores now are implanted all or three or four of the really major conflicts of our time. You are, I think, in the Mediterranean standing absolutely at the center of what I think you might term the Mediterranean, not as the source of reason and structure and order, but as a kind of boiling cauldron surrounded on all sides by conflict. If you were to try and lay down a center of gravity of conflict in the world, I suspect you might put it somewhere in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean. I want to talk about that and about three in particular conflicts. I also want to, Mario touched on it, and I think he's absolutely right. If there is one thing for which the countries that have bordered the Mediterranean have taught us, it is the importance of the triumph of reason. And we have lived, you might argue, these last 2,000 years through an age, an epoch of reason. And what I see now growing around us, I fear, is an age which threatens to turn into an age of unreason. It is those who propose unreason who seem to be trapped, and those who propose reason who seem to be falling back. And in this context, I want to touch, if I may, on the impending referendum in Britain. Reason, all the arguments you can assemble, would lead you to a conclusion that Great Britain, home of quiet, tolerant democracy, is going to pursue its ancient tradition of a reasonable outcome to a civilized debate and maintain the greatness of our nation, which does not, I think, in any way depend upon retreating behind our island walls and shouting insults at foreigners. It is rather to go out in the world and build those alliances. That's what's made our country great. And so I ought to be able to tell you that I'm confident about the 23rd of June. The polls point to a margin of 2 to 5 or 7%. The bookies tell you that they favor the odds of staying in. The people in Britain tell you that there is a high percentage, they believe, in the vote arriving at a conclusion, which is that we should remain in the European Union. And yet I greatly fear that this is not the truth, and I can give you no confidence. There is, I fear, in our country, implanted a sort of miserable, sullen grumpiness amongst many who fed these last 20 years by the myths and insults of the foreign-owned right-wing press in Britain, and not countered in any way by any politician who has stood up these last 20 years and argued the case for Europe. We are arguing against, in many cases, particularly amongst the white working class, if I may use that term, I hate it, working class, an utter determination for all the wrong reasons, because we'll have more control when in fact we'll have less, because they're fed up with the bureaucrats in Brussels, because they tell us what to do when in fact it's a form of democracy operated through the Council of Ministers, for all the reasons that are easily to dispel, which they don't want to listen to vote against. And I remain of the view that this is very, very touch and go. The result will probably not turn on an opinion poll. It will turn on the fact that the out campaign and those who will vote for it are more likely to vote, and those who want to vote in are less likely to vote. There's a lack of confidence in the forces of reason for you. I can't tell you the outcome. I'm afraid. I wish I could. I can tell you what the consequences will be. I think one consequence will very likely be, even though it's not rational, a second referendum in Scotland. If the people of Scotland vote for a European future, which is denied for them by the English votes, I think they will have a referendum. And even though the collapse in the oil price makes the case for separation, I would not be at all surprised if they left. And then we have the end of the United Kingdom, the end of the Union Jack. You have a little England that will tend, I fear, towards isolationism and the rise of nationalism, surrounded on Europe by all sides. And what benefit that will do my country, I don't know. It'll have a second consequence too, which is, I think, I wonder whether or not the two great parties, Labour and the Conservatives, can actually hold together under the pressures and the virulence of the divisions within their own party. And the third consequence is the one that Mario touched on. Will it lead to the beginnings of a process of disintegration in Europe? I can't say it will. I can say, however, that if the British people vote in this way, then it will give immense impetus to those forces of anti-Europeanism that are now rising on the right in every single European nation. And the consequences of that, I think, are unpredictable. We might touch on this later. Let me move to the challenges of your region rather than the challenges of my country. I said I thought that this would be a center of gravity of conflict in the world around the northeast corner of the Mediterranean. There are, it seems to me, three problems that now confront us, and maybe we'll touch on them, and I will only briefly, in the minutes left to me, mention them. The first is, obviously, we all know it, the rise of Islamic Jihad. My friend, now as Georges, who's coming in a moment, may comment on this more interestingly, but what I see around the Middle East now is not just the rise of an evil belief, an evil set of extremists. We've had those in Christianity many times down the years of history, but matched with, at the same time, the engagement of the international community, Russia, the West, in this conflict, and matched also with the collapse of institutions in the Middle East. I think this leads to something like the possibility of a perfect storm. And the question is, how do we solve it? And I can't give you an answer to that either. I can, however, say that it might be a useful starting point if we could put out the fires. And the biggest dominant fire is Syria. And here I have to agree, for the first time in my life, I think, disagree with James Rubin. If we could intervene to alter, if we had the will to intervene, to alter the balance of forces in Syria, maybe what James proposes is right. My own view is that since we don't have the will, we may have to govern our attitude to Syria much more on realpolitik and deal with the institutions that we have there, which, whether we like it or not, is Assad and a Russian engagement. By the way, right from the start, I said that the West's policy of removing Assad was idiotic. I said that 4 years ago. If you choose an aim for your policy which you do not have the means to achieve, you're going to end up with not looking very good at the end of this. We might talk about Syria in a moment. The second issue that I want to talk about, and God knows you feel it here, is the issue of migration. This extraordinary event. But it's not new. It is not new. We look on this as though it was some new phenomenon. It's absolutely not. Down the ages, we have seen vast movements of people fleeing pestilence and plague and war. This has been a fact of our life. Churchill called us in Britain the mongrel nation, and so we are. We are the product of those flows of immigrations, and London, by the way, is the mongrel city. It's one of the reasons why it works in the world. But we now have to face these vast floods of refugees. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, this is not new. But it's not going to go away either. This is a new fact of our life. And if you look at the stimulus for this, it's not just the conflict in Syria, it's the vast movements of people up from sub-Saharan Africa through, indeed, the North African coast. And that's going to increase. As global warming takes hold, that will increase. I was not long ago in Kuala Lumpur talking about the beginnings of mass migrations from the flooded Ganges Valley, the Ganges Delta. and many there were believing they had to work together. I draw three conclusions from this challenge. The first is, however you cope with them, you have to cope with them regionally. You can't cope with them by individual nations. And so if we want to look at this, we have no option but to look at it on a European level. The second is that I think this will be one of the great strategic challenges of our time, and we need to look at it like that. Not a short-term problem with a series of short-term solutions. My own view is that we probably need not only policies for our regions, but also a new international architecture to begin to deal with this. And my third point is a very European point. If you will not use your humanity to solve this problem, you'll be left with using barbed wire. And if you use barbed wire as the fundamental of the reason that you solve this, you will end up not with less conflict, but with more. My last point, which I think adds, I'm afraid I'm bound to say, to my gloom and pessimism, is along with the collapse, or the threatened collapse, of the European ideal, is also the collapse of the European and maybe even Western will to do things differently, to make things different. I personally think we've made a terrible mistake. We've been obsessed by shock and awe into believing that we see a problem in the world and the right solution for it is high explosive. It's not. I think we're in the new age of diplomacy. I think it's about building new relations and new alliances. And I think there's a real possibility to do that, by the way, which could have a very profound beneficial effect. The great British Foreign Secretaries Castlereagh and Canning must be spinning in their grave. They would have known that diplomacy is an essential part of our future, but it is the collapse of will that worries me. In the face of these challenges, if we have not got the will to begin to act, then we will not act to resolve them and pay the consequences ourselves. On the anniversary of Shakespeare's death, I am reminded of the speech of Miranda in Tempest, in which she says, if I recall, this may be right, she looks around and said, "Oh, what wondrous creatures are here gathered. What a beauteous thing is mankind. Oh, brave new world that with such people, that have such people in it." You know, it is that spirit of optimism that has borne us along these last 1,000 years of the civilization founded around this inland sea. If we cannot recover that, I fear a difficult future is likely to look a bit more difficult. Thank you very much.
Paddy, thank you very, very much indeed. I think Shakespeare would not be turning in his grave. He'll be very proud of you. Thank you so much. And now, last but not least, Fawaz Jerry's.